Welcome to the course Virtual Machines for Windows Azure. This is a course designed for IT professionals getting started with Windows Azure to understand and deploy and manage virtual machines on the Azure platform. To begin, as I said, my name is Corey Hines. I'm an MVP for Cloud and Data Center Automation, and I've worked in the IT field now for about 20 years in positions such as developers, administrators. I've been a trainer and a speaker. I've been an author. Done a lot of different things across a lot of different platforms, not just Microsoft, but obviously this is going to be fairly Microsoft focused. What we're going to do in this module is 5 major things. Number one, take a look at what virtual machines are in Azure. So what is an Azure virtual machine versus a traditional virtual machine? One of the things I would recommend you do is, if you haven't, take the Introduction to Azure course. We talk a little about the fundamentals of VMs on Azure, and that's good information leading into this one. We'll look at how we create VMs, look at some demos on how we accomplish that, some basic VM configuration tasks, how we manage the disks for a virtual machine, both creating disks, adding disks, and even uploading disks from my own data center. And then finally, some simple virtual machine management tasks, how we monitor, for example, performance. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and jump in. So let's take a second and compare Azure virtual machines versus on-premise Hyper-V virtual machines. Now, for most administrators, this is where the biggest difference becomes. And it's not something that you should be afraid of, it's something you should embrace. There's differences in the way they're configured and differences in the way you manage them. And so there's changes in how you think about your virtual machines as an element of your infrastructure. So let's begin by taking a look. The single biggest thing that I think most administrators get uncomfortable with is this notion that within Azure, there is no console access to a virtual machine. This is both a security design point and also a point of ensuring that no one else can get access to anything and no one else can see what's going on in your VM. The only way you get console access if you run on Hyper-V. Within Azure, it's RDP access only. The second point here, very important point, only Generation 1 virtual machines. If you're creating a virtual machine on Hyper-V, it has to be a Generation 1 or it cannot migrate to Azure. If you require a Generation 2 virtual machine, Hyper-V is going to be your solution. Azure does not support the VHDX file format. Now that comes as a shock to a lot of people, but it's no big deal. You can run a simple PowerShell command and you can convert any VHDX to VHD and stick it in Azure. So the file format is not an issue. Upgrade of the guest operating system within Azure, not supported. You would deploy a different version of the operating system. Requires ownership of physical hardware. With Azure, you don't own the physical hardware. Microsoft does. You're simply leveraging their hardware. Can you run antivirus? Both of them support antivirus. And then more than one network adapter. It depends on the size of the VM. Many VMs support multiple network adapters. When you're deploying a virtual machine, you've got to choose a size that supports more than one NIC. So it gives you an idea of, as you're comparing my on-premise Hyper-V with Azure, what are some of the major differences between the two? Okay, in this first module, let's take a look at an introduction to IAAS virtual machines. Now, a great place to start is, identifying what is a good virtual machine workload to actually put on Azure. We know we can run virtual machines on Hyper-V in our data center, but does everything we do in our data center translate to Azure? Is everything we do in our data center suitable to run on Azure? And the answer is that, well, not everything is. So what do we recommend? What are the suitable workloads for Azure? Anything that requires high availability. Clustering and high availability is a fairly complex thing to configure and requires a fairly deep amount of IT knowledge. Azure makes it very easy to configure geographically distributed, highly available virtual machines. You don't need to understand the underlying storage and network fabric to do it. You can take a workload or an application in a VM, place it on Azure, and let Azure take care of the high availability. Any type of virtual machine that has unpredictable growth. So, the example I use a lot and I will continue to use is an accounting firm. We know that in April of the year, we're going to need to grow our capacity significantly because it's tax season. Azure virtual machines allow us to do that by sizing up and sizing down without having to buy additional underlying hardware. We can simply make the virtual machine bigger, pay for it, and then shrink it down again. It's also great for workloads that are very, very steady. So we know that we need just this one little app to do this one little thing, and it's going to be very steady all the time. The cost of Azure for these steady workloads is incredibly low. Some things that are unsuitable for Azure. Anything that is very low capacity. If you're running this and it's just a background app, it doesn't use a lot of energy, it doesn't use a lot of compute power, you're probably going to wind up paying more on Azure just for running the virtual machine than you will get out of the benefit. So anything that's a very small workload, probably not that suitable. And then any environment that is, heavily regulated, maybe not suitable for Azure because Azure is going to want to take control of certain things. If you don't want to use a virtual machine, or if the application in the virtual machine, is not suitable, there's other alternatives. For example, you can use App Service or Service Fabric. Instead of running the app in a VM, change the application a little bit, run the application directly on Azure. What's supported in Azure virtual machines? Anything that you can install on Windows Server as an app, you can run in Windows Server on Azure. It's still Windows Server. Nothing in Windows Server has changed, just where it's running. So any app you can run on Windows Server, if you can run it in Hyper-V or on hardware, you can run it in Windows Server on Azure, including things like SharePoint, System Center, etc. You can also run many Linux distributions on Azure. Now, Microsoft does provide certain Linux distributions that it certifies and supports, but there are many other Linux distributions that are not certified and supported that you can also run on Azure. Once you put your virtual machine on Azure, you need to think about sizing. Now, sizing determines things like, well, the price, obviously. The bigger the virtual machine, the more it's going to cost. However, sizing also determines to a degree the capability of the virtual machine. For example, some virtual machines allow multiple NICs. Some sizes have multiple NICs, some do not. Some virtual machines are 4, 16, 32 cores. Others might be smaller. Some virtual machines include GPUs, graphical processing units. Some do not. So choosing the size of the virtual machine, and we'll see how to do this in a second, is going to determine what basic features and capabilities that virtual machine has, but also the underlying cost of that virtual machine. Now, it's no surprise that if you're going to migrate an infrastructure to Azure, determining, estimating what that's going to cost can be a very complicated process. And for that, Microsoft provides something called the Azure Cost Estimator tool. It scans your hardware, and for example, if you have a System Center Virtual Machine Manager implementation, you can point this at your Virtual Machine Manager, and it will look at the work that's happening, and then based on what it sees in, with I/O, with CPU, with memory utilization, it's going to recommend the best corresponding Azure Virtual Machine configuration and give you a 30-day estimate of what that's going to cost. So it makes it very easy to do a direct comparison of the cost of Azure versus the cost of running your own infrastructure. So what we'll do is take a second and just take a look at how we can use this cost estimator tool and also do some of the sizing of virtual machines. So first, let's take a look at the Azure Cost Estimator. This is a tool you can just, Bing search or Google search for it, the Azure Cost Estimator. You'll download it and install it, and it kind of looks something like this. It's pretty simple and straightforward. It's going to do a couple of things. You can build custom profiles to look for exact, workloads or applications or servers, or you can choose one of the default profiles and tell it, hey, here's my SCVMM infrastructure, here's a Hyper-V server, or here's a box, here's a single server, single machine that I want to migrate into Azure. And for example, in the case of a single machine, it just wants enough information that it can connect to it and then profile how much work that system is doing, how much disk activity, network activity, CPU activity, and so forth. And then based on that, recommend what you should create in Azure so that you have just enough compute capacity to handle the workload that this server is using. You then move to Azure, create a virtual machine for the workload, and you can then adjust the size of that virtual machine as the demand goes up or goes down. To adjust the size of a virtual machine, you simply find the virtual machine within your Azure portal, whether it's the classic portal or in the case what we're using right here, the new portal. We're going to click on it. It's going to open the properties blade for that virtual machine. And then down here towards the bottom, we're going to have a VM size option. Now, depending on the region or the area that you've deployed this virtual machine in, the available sizes may vary a little bit. For example, G-class virtual machines are not available everywhere. And so we can see that right now I can just go through, look at the sizes, and then it gives me just an estimate of what the cost of running that size is. And let's say I want to move this to a, let's do a D2 V2. We'll click on it, click select, and it's going to go out and adjust the size of that virtual machine. Be aware, however, that in most cases, it's got to reboot the virtual machine to adjust the size. So you want to take care to plan size adjustments because they may very well incur some downtime. This next module, we're going to look at how we create virtual machines in Windows Azure. Now, to get started, we want to do a little bit of thinking, we want to do a little bit of planning. We don't just simply go in and create a VM. We've talked about, what are the workloads that are suitable for Azure, and we obviously want to begin and determine, is the thing that we're going to put in this virtual machine even a suitable workload for Azure? So there's a couple of things we're going to do, during that process. Number one, we're going to size the VMs. We talked about the sizing tool. Make sure that we can create an appropriate size and make sure the cost is going to be effective. We want to learn how to connect to the virtual machine. How are we going to manage it? Is this going to be part of a domain? Is it going to be standalone? If it's standalone, are we connecting to it with PowerShell? So how do we manage that virtual machine when we consider the entire management strategy of all the resources we've got to have? What is the networking going to look like? How are we going to connect to it? Is this going to be a simple standalone service that we put in Azure and connect to over the web? Or is this going to be on our network, maybe via VPN? And then finally, how do I back up and restore it? Azure provides disaster recovery and provides fault tolerance, but it's still ultimately up to you to make sure that you leverage those tools and those capabilities to have a backup of your virtual machine. If we're thinking about doing a migration, there are some things we want to keep in mind. If we're going to upload the virtual machine, convert it to a VHD, we have to generalize it using sysprep. If it's a running virtual machine that's already in our environment, it has to be sysprep before it can go into Azure. Now, in many cases, that's going to prevent you from doing that migration if you're running an application that, for example, cannot be sysprepped. And then finally, it's got to be a fixed size virtual disk. Now, the good news is the upload will convert it to a fixed size virtual disk. So you can have it as a dynamic on a local Hyper-V server. If you use the right tools, it'll convert it to a fixed size on the way up, so you don't upload all this empty data. There are several tools at your disposal to do this. You have the portal, both the new and the classic. Bear in mind, the classic portal can only use version 1 virtual machines. The new portal can do both version 1 and version 2 virtual machines. Now, these are not to be confused with generation 1 and generation 2. The version 2 virtual machines, or V2 VMs on Azure, are created with the Azure Resource Manager. You can do this via PowerShell, and you can also do this via the Azure cross-platform client that we're going to talk about towards the end of this module. And then finally, you can do it in the portals. You can do a quick create in the classic portal, which creates a VM for you from a template VHD. There's a gallery, which contains, it's a library of virtual machines. A lot of them have pre-installed software like SQL Server. And in the new portal, this is all done via the Azure Marketplace. So with that in mind, let's look at some ways that we can create basic Windows virtual machines within Azure. Okay, let's go ahead and use the Azure portal to create a new Windows virtual machine. I'm going to click on Virtual Machines, and then just click Add. Now, what this is going to give me is the list of all the different virtual machine options that are in the Azure Marketplace. And there's literally hundreds and hundreds in here, and you can scroll through and search and kind of find the operating system or the solution or the virtual machine configuration that you're looking for. We're going to do a simple Windows Server virtual machine. And it's going to give us all the different variations of a Windows Server virtual machine that we can deploy. And so the one we're going to choose is a Windows Server 2012 R2 data center. So it's current release of Windows Server. We'll choose that. It's going to ask us for a deployment model. Now we're going to use the Resource Manager deployment model, which is the deployment model used by the new Azure portal, not the classic deployment, which is based on services that was used by the old portal. And then we're going to click Create. Now it's going to prompt us for some basic information. So for example, what's the name of this VM? Let's call it Server 1. What type of disks do I want to have? We're going to go with SSDs. A username, a password, the subscription, and then we're going to put this in a new resource group, which we're going to call servers. And then finally the location, which data center do we want this created in? So we've satisfied all these basic requests, basic information to create the VM. We'll click OK. The next step is the virtual machine size. So based on the data center that we selected, we're going to see the available sizes of virtual machines. Now, it's giving us initially only the recommended virtual machine. We can view all available sizes to see all our options. You can see there's a lot of choice in here. I'm going to go with just a very simple, low-end, standard virtual machine. Click on it, and then hit Select. Next, we've got some optional features. So if we want to now get into configuring things like the details of our networking, the details of our public IP addresses, any inbound firewall rules, we can define all this as we're creating the VM. We're not going to change anything in here, so we're just going to go ahead and click OK. It's now going to validate that what we've asked Azure to do can be done in the data center location we've selected. So it's validating all those different settings, tells us it's passed, click OK, and it now submits the deployment. And so what this is going to do is in the background, go ahead and deploy that new virtual machine and then let us know when it's ready. The deployment's completed, the VM is running, and I'm automatically taken to that new virtual machine property page where I can now begin to look at it, review it, and then make any configuration changes that I want. So there you have it, pretty simple, creating a new virtual machine using the Azure portal. Now that we've seen that in the portal, what does this look like in PowerShell? So for Azure Service Manager, the classic portal, here's an example of a PowerShell command that we would use to go ahead and create a new virtual machine. So new Azure VM config. This represents the actual configuration of the VM, so it's creating a new virtual machine. Now, the way that you kind of want to look at the flow of this, towards the end, there's a new Azure VM commandlet. The process you generally follow is to create a config, and then you realize that config as an actual virtual machine. So the process of building the config can be, a lengthy, elaborate process, and when you're done and that configuration is set, you realize the new virtual machine. And so you can see some of the inputs we're putting in here. For example, we're putting in the instance size. I'm going to switch to my highlighter real quick. So we have our instance size that we're putting in. We have the name of the image. So let's take a look at using the classic Azure PowerShell commandlets or the Azure Service Manager commandlets to deploy a new virtual machine to the classic portal. So to do this, I'm initially just going to set a bunch of variables. So we've got a location, a subscription name, a storage account name, the actual version of Windows I want to deploy in this virtual machine, a service name I'm going to create, a VM name, and then the size, which I've listed at an A5. Now we've already set our subscription, and we can just do a get Azure subscription to see that we've already logged on, the subscription is active, and we do have a storage account set. So we don't need to select the subscription or set the subscription. We do need, however, to get the image that we want to use from the image gallery. So we're using get Azure VM image, and then the family that we wanted to use, and just selecting the first available version. We're then going to use a new Azure service to build a new service. Again, passing in just a name and a location, which will be East US. We're then going to create a new configuration object for a virtual machine. And this uses new Azure VM config, the name of the VM, the size, and the image that we want as part of this virtual machine. The next step is to generate some credentials that are going to be injected into the VM setup process. Go ahead and inject those as what's known as Azure provisioning configuration. And then finally, call a new Azure VM referencing the virtual machine configuration we just created, which will submit a new deployment and create that new virtual machine. And that process will obviously take a little while, so we'll let that run in the background. And in fact, if we go over to the new portal now, we should see that we do in fact have the service created, and then we should begin to see the virtual machine come in here in just a second. So we'll just refresh our view. And there's the virtual machine. Now this one is not fully deployed yet. It's got to start and complete all its setup options, which takes a little bit of time, but we can see that using those commandlets, we can automate the process of doing just about everything, including creating new virtual machines. Now, here's a similar thing, but using virtual machine creation using Azure Resource Manager. So these are the Azure RM, again, want to make sure we call that out, commandlets. So again, we're creating a new config. We just kind of want to walk through this process. We're going to set the operating system on the configuration. One of the things we're doing is enabling auto update in the operating system. We're going to set the source image. So this is the image that it's actually going to come from. And I want to look at this command in a little bit of detail because it's using the Windows Server 2012 R2, the most recent version. That's what the keyword latest is. We're then going to add a network interface, attach a VHD, and then finally realize the VM. And you'll notice because we're using Azure Resource Manager, I'm relying on a resource group. So part of realizing the VM is indicating which resource group that the virtual machine is actually stored in. So that's an example of what that looks like in PowerShell. So let's take a look at creating virtual machines in Azure with PowerShell and ARM. All right, so in this demo, we'll take a look at how we can do the exact same thing we did in the portal, which is just create a basic Windows virtual machine using the Azure PowerShell commandlets. Now, so again, we've already logged on, as I kind of said before, and we're not going to, what we're going to do is we're going to create all the objects needed for a virtual machine. Now, we already have a resource group. We already have a storage account left over from the last time we did this. We could very easily go in and just, add a new VM to this if we wanted to. Just add a second, maybe file server 02, reuse the network, reuse the storage. But for the sake of kind of being thorough, we're not going to do any of that. We're just going to go ahead and create all the objects needed to support a VM, all the underlying support objects, as well as the virtual machine itself. So it's a pretty straightforward process. The first thing we do is create a resource group. And so this is, basic standard stuff. Central US, call the group PowerShell VM, storing the name in variables because all the other PowerShell commands, that way we don't got to retype everything and risk a typo. We're then going to do a storage account. So a very simple storage account, check the availability of the name, and then create a new storage account, and we're just going to store it in a variable because we're going to reference it later. And so creating the storage account take a couple of minutes depending on how busy Azure is. So we'll let that go ahead and run. So we got the storage account. Next step is the networking. Now for the networking, we have 4 objects we're creating a subnet, creating a public IP address, creating a virtual network that the subnet's going to be a part of, and then creating a NIC that we're actually going to attach to the virtual machine. So very straightforward, 4 simple commands. Again, not necessarily required for a VM, because you can reuse the network, you can reuse the subnet. You obviously need to create a new NIC, you need a new public IP address, but you can reuse a number of these objects. So again, not specific to the VM itself, but part of that underlying infrastructure that's needed. So go ahead and let those commands run and create the subnet, get the public IP address, create the virtual network. You can see here we're actually attaching the subnet to the virtual network when it's created. And then when we create the NIC, we're actually attaching it to our subnet, and we're associating that public IP address that we requested. Okay, so those are done. Now we begin to set up our virtual machine. So we got a VM name. This is, if you're used to Hyper-V, this is the Hyper-V console name. This is the name that appears in the Azure portal, VM FSO2, and then a computer name. This is the Windows computer name. So, if you did a sysprep or, any sort of fresh install, you got to name the machine. This is the name that's going to be given to the operating system. And so we'll begin by getting some administrator credentials. So we're going to set a new admin account, call HS admin, password. So we've got some credentials to feed to the deployment process. Now we're going to create a new VM, which is going to be a standard A1 size. We're going to set some characteristics of the operating system, such as the name of the computer, the credentials that are going to be used, and then the fact that automatic updates are going to be turned on. So we'll run that. Now we're going to indicate which image we want installed in this virtual machine from Azure. So we want Microsoft Windows Server, and we want 2012 R2, the latest version. So we'll add that to the configuration. Next, we'll add the network interface card, the network adapter that we created when we did the networking setup a few moments ago. And then move on to the next step, which is storage. So we need to deploy this VM into a VHD. So let's define a VHD. And let's designate that VHD as our operating system disk. And then finally, attach that virtual machine to our new VM definition, indicating this is where the actual image that comes from Azure is going to be installed. So this is the storage for the Azure virtual machine. And then finally, our last step, now that we've built everything, we can go ahead and ask Azure, hey, go ahead, deploy this virtual machine. So the deployment process is going to take a little bit, anywhere from, it depends on the load, but typically this takes about 2-3 minutes. So we'll go ahead and let this run. And if we go back to our portal, you can see that in the portal, let's refresh our view. We can see the resource group that we created. We can see all the objects we created, including our virtual machine VM FSO2. And if we click on it, you can see the status of this VM is now creating. So there it is. We've actually used PowerShell to create a new virtual machine in Azure, all the objects that are required for a virtual machine, and we've kept it all separate in a nice little resource group so we can easily manage it, delete it, assign permissions to it, or whatever else we want to do.